I was wondering how to introduce Beth Green, and it occurred to me that I wanted to call her a rising star, but that I was probably already a little late in the arc. And then I started wondering whether stars in fact rise, and got into astronomy, and that was sort of lost the metaphor. Beth's work is increasingly widely known and respected. I traveled quite a bit this summer and was in a number of countries and in places that were already interacting with Beth and knew her work and were talking to me about it. Beth holds degrees from the universities of Oxford, Cambridge, and London, thus making sure she didn't make any of the major players in the UK feel left out. She currently serves as Programme Director for Education at CARDUS, a social policy think tank located in Canada, based in Canada, and that's rightly drawn widespread attention, among other things, for its empirical work and related public policy advocacy related to the outcomes of Christian schooling and the place of faith-based schooling in society. What for me makes her work particularly interesting and valuable in this context is that she combines a fierce, and I use the word advisedly, a fierce commitment to and significant expertise in empirical research with a sensitivity to and investment in theological thinking. And it's not universal to find those things in the same place. And she seeks to relate both of those to strategic, concrete questions about what we should be doing in Christian education at the present time. At a time that's being shaped, I think, by tensions between a pervasive emphasis on empirical, accountable assessment and more belief-driven narratives about what education ought to be. Beth positions her work to engage both, and to do so with rigor and with practical applicability. She's increasingly in demand internationally as a consultant and speaker on various aspects of Christian education, and she serves as one of the editors of the International Journal of Christianity and Education. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to have her share some of her current thinking with us this evening. Thank you, Beth.
Thank you, David. Well, as you can tell from the accent, I'm English, but I'm also, by adoption now, Canadian, which means, means I have to start with an apology, because I'm shortchanging you on buzzwords. The grammar police amongst you will have noticed that we have buzzwords plural, but I'm actually only unpacking innovation. And that's because I kind of got carried away in my ambitions originally. I've been thinking about innovation as part of a cluster of buzzwords. Excellence, character, measurement. And I soon realized that you can't talk about all of those in the 45 minutes that I've got. So I had to restrict it to one, but I forgot to take the S off the slide. I want to thank David also because I have very much grown up through these Kaya's teaching and learning conferences, both professionally and personally. I remember, well, the very first time that I came, and some of the friendships that I made there are really important in my work now, and it's quite an honor to be one of the keynote speakers. It's been an important part of my academic formation, so thank you, David. Well, it is a critique, not entirely without merit, that the teaching profession in particular is resistant to change. And that education is one of the most intransigent institutions in Western society, ripe for liberation from the industrial models of the past for which it was designed. That argument is central to a book you may have come across by Wagner and Dintersmith. It's called Most Likely to Succeed, Preparing Our Kids for the Innovation Era. I don't know if you noticed the juxtaposition there of kind of innovation and success. And higher education doesn't escape Wagner and Dintersmith's critique either. So these are not arguments just restricted to K-12. I think they're going to resonate for all educators and institutions of education. And they resonate for the very practical reason that many parents and students appear to be voting with their feet, or their college fund, clamoring for the kind of campus that has an independent coffee shop, boho vintage vibe, and for courses that mean they can walk straight into a highly paid job in tech or solve crime using cool gadgets, maybe at CSI, perhaps even both at the same time, like the X-Men or Marvel's Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. To be less facetious, they resonate because preparing young people for the kinds of jobs that we know don't even exist yet feels like a pressing task, especially when there are some questions around our ability to master turning out young people from certain parts of the public education system who are functionally literate and numerate. And as educators, we are often surrounded by innovation strategies, conferences, summits, mindsets, software solutions, and policies. I'm well aware that your inboxes and your social media feeds are flooded with innovative solutions to problems you didn't even know that you had. I'm also aware that a source of one or two of these emails might just be an edgy Canadian think tank bothering you about social architecture when you're mostly just focused on surviving to the end of the semester. What is a think tank anyway? It sounds suspiciously like one of those places with a lot of bare wooden beams, steel and glass, designed to get you in the mood for innovation. For what it's worth, there aren't actually any beanbags in my office, but to the amusement of some of my colleagues, I did actually walk into my glass wall. Now, I'm making light of this, but I know that for some of you, the urgency of all things innovation seems tyrannous, particularly when it requires another round of professional development or learning to operate another web portal. And if you actually had the time to spend with students and colleagues just thinking, shooting the breeze, experimenting, building relationships, maybe you feel that the innovation your administrators are hassling you for might actually occur more naturally. Others of you here will already consider yourselves education innovators. It's where you get your mojo from. And if I can't make my point in an 8-minute TED talk, or maybe it's 13 minutes, we were having a disagreement about that on our table, you're going to wonder anyway, why I'm up here being presented as any kind of expert in anything. So I'm going to make my case in less than 20 seconds, so that if you need to, you can stop listening, get back on Instagram, Snapchat, wherever it's at now. Here it is. I agree that our institutions of education need refreshing. I would really like to see Christian education leading that change. But in order to do so, we will need to be willing to adopt a distinctively Christian posture towards innovation in teaching and learning, because the one that Silicon Valley is selling to us is not radical enough. Okay, so I lied a little bit. You will need to listen to the rest of the talk to find out why I think it's not radical enough and what I think the alternative might be. Innovation in teaching and learning it's everywhere. According to George Couros, who wrote a very popular book called The Innovator's Mindset, innovation is one of the most used words in education right now. And in that book, he rightly challenges 3 common misconceptions about innovation. Firstly, that it's about how you use technology. Secondly, that it's reserved just for the few. And thirdly, that it is solely a product. And in just the same way that teaching and learning is not inherently Christian because we baptize it with curriculum content, I agree with Couros that technology is not inherently innovative just because it's convenient or stylish. Couros argues that innovation is a mindset. In other words, it's about how you use the technology. And Couros conceives of innovation as a process rather than a product, arguing that what that does is democratizes innovation and opens it up to everyone, because every teacher can adopt an innovation mindset. The following confession probably puts me at odds with some very eminent voices in our profession, but here we go anyway. I'm not entirely convinced about mindsets. I think posture might be more important. And posture incorporates mindset, but it also, of course, encompasses practice. And I think practice is the critical and often forgotten part of teaching and learning. I also think practice is the often neglected child of the social sciences and theology, at least within certain strands of the academy. But maybe that's a lecture, for another time. Today, I'm going to argue that it's better to understand innovation as a posture than a mindset. And I'm going to take further my exploration of innovation as a buzzword, using the idea of posture in ways that I think might be particular to the conversation we're trying to have about distinctively Christian teaching and learning. First, an aside, but it's an important one for clarification. Trevor, who's going to be speaking to us tomorrow, and David have written extensively elsewhere about this idea of Christian distinctiveness as opposed to uniqueness. There's a very useful summary of that argument on the What If Learning website if you want to look for it. And I'm in agreement with them that the task of Christian teaching is to find ways of teaching that are genuinely consistent with our Christian faith, but also genuinely educationally useful, helpful to students. And it's important to understand that that might well lead to the affirmation of practices from sources other than those of Christian institutions, doctrine, and tradition. Just as it might also lead to the opposition of practices from any sources that undermine or oppose faithfulness to Christian calling. So that rests on quite a robust theology of common grace, but one that is entirely consistent, I think, with Orthodox Christian faith. The argument about Christian distinctiveness also rests on a community of practice-based theory of teaching and learning and a critical realist epistemology. Briefly, community of practice-based accounts of teaching and learning attempt to take seriously our interactions as persons with each other, with faith, and with social structures as they're enacted in the complexity of the social world. Critical realism, in my view, charts a helpful middle route between the extremes of rationalism and relativism. And I will regard both of those epistemologies as deeply problematic, particularly for Christians who want to remain faithful to orthodox belief in things like God's self-revelation, our particular vocation as persons, the existence of evil, and the authority of God in the body of the church and in Scripture. So critical realism asserts that there is a reality that can be known, that can be spoken about with confidence and investigated. But it presents us with a way of knowing that is always mediated by assumptions and attributes that are often precognitive or little reflected upon, such as age, class, gender, religion, and race. Now, it's not necessary to follow these theoretical arguments, or even to be particularly interested in them, in order to get something out of my paper this evening. But I do wish to make one cautionary statement, because in my view, a lack of attention to epistemology, theories of social practice, and personhood as educators leads to poor faith formation in learners. And I've written about this elsewhere. But at best, if you ignore those three things, learners become exposed to naive renderings of Christian practices and doctrine, which will only serve to affirm the liberal secular view that faith is largely irrelevant outside of the private domain. At worst, if you ignore those three things, learners experience Christian faith as profoundly damaging and antithetical to the process of critical thinking and reflective practice. Now again, if you're interested, a fuller explanation of the intersection of these theological and theoretical perspectives can be found in Trevor's book, Christian Faith in English Church Schools. But to conclude the slide, I just want to show you this slide. This image of the three-legged stool is very popular in Catholic education, church, school, parish. Brick uses it in his massive study of Catholic schooling. And I suppose what I'm declaring to you is that the three legs of my stool are distinctively Christian, community of practice, critical realism. That's the framework on which I'm building my argument, although it's beyond the bounds of the paper to get into them any further this evening. So, let's return to innovation in education, and I wanted you to consider this observation from my friend Ray Jarrett. I'm inherently very suspicious of anything with the word innovation in the title. Anyone that uses it generally has no idea what it means. Now, Ray is one of the most innovative thinkers I know, and he's not even a millennial. Ray was one of the architects of the strategic plan for the Sydney Olympic Games, and he knows that I like a challenge, and he sets them out in emails like this from time to time. And I think possibly it's just a clever ruse to get someone else to do his thinking for him, which is convenient, if not innovative. The rise of educational startups like AltSchool and curriculum programs like Mathletics, and the arrival of iPads in the classroom would certainly not be possible without technology and the development of new software platforms. Just pause for a moment and notice what happened then, because I inserted the word startup into that first sentence. How many of you now have an image of the Golden Gate Bridge or those hipsters on beanbags drinking espresso coffees in your minds? And how many of you have already started wearily thinking, I'm too old to innovate? Certainly because I used the word startup and I referenced, even obliquely, Silicon Valley. Many of us will have assumed, right, we're back on track now, we're talking about innovation. And my point here isn't to be a Luddite or to comment on Mathletics. My point here is to highlight that there's already a story that comes along with the buzzword innovation. And I want us to consider it, and then I want us to see if we can rehabilitate the notion of innovation as a posture within a distinct, not necessarily different, Christian story. Because remember, I'm not always convinced that difference has to be the goal for Christian practice. Chorus does right to challenge the misconceptions, but he doesn't go far enough. Who is the story of innovation written for? What are its synonyms and metaphors? So to move forward and unpack the story told, perhaps even sold, along with innovation, I want to consider AltSchool as an example. Former Google executive Max Ventilla founded AltSchool. The Economist, Forbes magazine, The New Yorker, they're all hyperventilating about AltSchool because Silicon Valley billionaires, who are now sort of considered the archetypal innovators, aren't they, in our contemporary culture, they've contributed about $133 million worth of venture capital to it. And this is sort of seen now as the classic example of disruptive innovation in the education world, improving the ways in which we think about systems of delivery. So I want to pare back the hype from the shiny pages of the business and lifestyle glosses just for a moment and point out a few things about AltSchool. But first, I want to address the notion of posture, and particularly our posture together as we do this. Because I rather suspect that in an audience like this, there is a strong temptation to climb onto our moral high horses, if we're not there already, at the mention of billionaires, Google, and AltSchool. What, we want to know, can millennials without research degrees know about the serious business of the classroom and the lecture hall? Where would they be without their expensive, private American liberal arts education? I want to remind everybody, myself included, that we, as educators, tell ourselves stories about education too. The French social theorist Pierre Bourdieu points out the uncomfortable reality that all of us sitting here have to a certain extent won in the game of education. Even if we do not drink Californian red with our dinner, he would also have plotted that onto a graph, by the way, and here it is, or someone's amusing version of it. I'm going to return to him in a moment. Posture is always related to practice. I have a hunch, because of how much time I spend bent over my computer. My physiotherapist says I'm like the letter C. Posture is always related to practice, and to adopt a particular posture is to act in a way that reifies a belief shaped by cultural norms. So to adopt a posture of humility, for example, physically limits our range of motion, affording kind of greater space and position to the other person. So in Western culture, we might do it by maybe inclining our head forward a little and bowing, or walking a few steps behind someone out of deference. In Eastern culture, we might remain standing. We might avoid eye contact. Posture is an enacted practice shaped by cultural context. Even to adopt a neutral stance is to choose to enact a particular set of assumptions around the possibility of being in the world without affecting it. Being in an environment and not affecting it, of course, is both physically and epistemologically impossible. But this does not stop it being a staple assumption about how we do science and educational research. And Bourdieu's tremendous legacy, theoretical legacy for the social sciences, was to explain the extent to which culture is regulated and then reproduced by these practices and postures. And his work demonstrated the primary role that education plays in this. And it illustrated that to be in a position to prescribe the posture is to wield significant power. And the idea that teaching and learning is always played out in the context of a community of practice reintroduces some helpful tools into the space of teaching and learning. Posture is a really important tool, but it can't work independently of another tool. I don't know if tool is the right word for this, but I've been talking about it a lot in many of the sessions that I've been in today. And that is, of course, telos, or direction. What is the posture orientated towards? Or to put it another way, what is innovation for? What is alt school for? So the first interesting point about alt school is that the $133 million invested in it is actually quite a small fraction of the estimated net worth if you take the 13 richest people in tech, which would be about $450 billion. It's also a fraction of the $634 billion spent by the US government on public schooling. The last figures I had available were 2013-14. So, there appears to be something around economic value, both in relation to wealth and efficiency, in the story being told around innovation. Second point, alt schools actually build around the idea of personalized learning. So learners are involved in setting the projects that they work on. So there's at very least an implicit notion of the person at the center of the learning. The third point is that alt school aims to create a software platform for personalized learning that both public and private schools can use. And with this, it's traversing the public-private split in US education in interesting ways. These are all features associated with reconfiguring the system of education to meet the learning needs of an individual. Small, but also global, anti-bureaucratic, crossing the public-private divide, a kind of benign person-centered anarchism. These are all parts of the alt school innovation story. You are probably itching to throw objections to me at this point about the hypocrisy of this story in the light of the fact that corporate America underwrites the tech industry, trickle-down wealth is a myth, the presence of tech companies doesn't raise wages for the urban poor. Some of you will tell me that innovations like alt school are not about parent power or learner power. They're about making profit out of a pedagogy and systems management. Some of you will tell me that the Christian universities and schools at which you work are already quite a long way down the road of online learning and blended delivery for the simple reason that they will not survive economically without utilizing this innovation. One half of the room will also think that personalised problem-based learning is the future, and the other half will be committed to classical liberal arts. This is sort of my point, because this is precisely where our contemporary limited story of innovation leaves us. Technologically astute, fiercely competitive at the economic margins, and obsessed with product. I want to explore another example of innovation in teaching and learning, a Latin textbook. And my thanks to David, who originally introduced me to this. I'm going to argue that it presents us with a potentially different posture from which to consider innovation. Before I do so, I want to consider some synonyms for innovation, which I think help to explain why contemporary educators might not even recognise a Latin textbook as an innovation in teaching and learning. Because I think we confuse innovation with two other words, new and change. I alluded to this in my introduction, because I think this confusion is one of the reasons why some educators experience innovation as a form of tyranny. A particular story emerges from the confusion because, in short, we've begun to ascribe a value judgment to innovation. New and change are good, old and historic, bad. In a recent essay for comment, Alan Jacobs points out the serious problem of uncritically accepting stories like this, because they exclude memory, the importance of rootedness, and they discard as refuse traditional understanding of ways of knowing and wisdom. And Jacobs is essentially making an epistemological argument that our ways of knowing have become too small, and our pathways too focused on change and progress for their own sake. And it struck me as I read the essay that when Jacobs describes the kind of tinkering and improvisation that our ancestors engaged in, just getting on with daily life in the village or stumbling across the invention of penicillin, he's essentially describing a posture of innovation. Now, he uses Levi-Strauss's notion of social bricolage, but one could easily substitute social innovation into his definition. Tinkering with what's available, building social structures and practices by improvisation rather than plan and out of spare parts. It is a practice that requires cunning. Cunning sounds kind of sexy and subversive and glamorous, perhaps more in line with the story about innovation our culture prefers to tell. But as Jacobs is aware, cunning in Old English also refers to a different kind of knowing. In this case, an awareness of another dimension beyond the visible reality. There is a deeper magic. A truly innovative posture is not bound to follow the rather more obvious pathways which the rest of us tread. Innovation is deeply risky, often lonely, and can promote great dislocation and pain. When we tell the story of innovation, do we talk about this as much as we do about the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow straddling that valley in California? In the 17th century, the Queen of Sweden learnt Latin from a textbook written by a refugee and exiled Moravian bishop, John Amos Comenius. He dialogued with Descartes. He insisted on a holistic conception of wisdom in the face of dualism. There's also some evidence that he turned down a mega job offer to lead the newly founded Harvard College. And we're probably more impressed by stories of Comenius dueling with famous philosophers and turning down what was to become an elite Ivy League university job than we are by what sounds like a dusty old Latin textbook. It's the Latin textbook, however, that is most innovative, or rather, the process of language learning that it promoted. For Comenius, intoning grammar and vocab, often still a staple of language learning, that wasn't enough. And it was not enough because it put the learner, the knowledge, and the practice of communicating into separate compartments. Yes, you do have to learn the basics. But if you have a deeper imagination about who the learner is and what language is for, it will not do to separate out knowing from practice. And learning is more effective when we apply knowledge, content, and skills to the world that the learner inhabits. And for the Christian, the world that we live in also includes the spiritual domain. And David's written extensively and led us in this whole conversation about what difference it makes in teaching and learning if we fully address the question, what does it mean to view the learner as a spiritual being? And Comenius's textbooks were groundbreaking for their illustrations and their use of parallel vernacular and Latin texts. Turner describes them as creating a realistic visual guide to the entire world of things to be learned. Comenius's innovations in teaching and learning were a direct result of his Christian faith working itself out in a philosophical yet deeply practical critique of educational epistemology and practice. Unlike the Enlightenment philosophers of his day, and unlike the edtech philanthropists of ours, he didn't believe that education on its own was the answer to the massive disruption characterized by war, ethnic and sectarian division, and the emergence of new economic powers that he saw in the world around him. And doesn't that sound like a contemporary description? Let me read it again. Massive disruption characterized by war, ethnic and sectarian division, and the emergence of new economic powers. Comenius did, however, believe in reform, and that Christians have a responsibility, a vocation, to seek it, because the pathway to reforming schools, universities, and society rests on returning the world to its proper centre, the purpose for which it was made, the glory of the Lord Jesus. It's possible that some of his educational goals don't strike us today as particularly exceptional. Comenius advocated for universal education for both men and women of all classes. He insisted on a broad curriculum, holistic in its developmental goals. He argued for learning experiences that put the learner at the centre and which were applied, meaningful to their context, ordered, and above all, were fun. Many of those goals also motivate the innovators behind Alt School. This is how one of their middle school students describes their experience. At Alt School, I flourished intellectually, emotionally, and socially. I feel joy walking into the classroom every day. Our teachers are the heart of our community. Being here, I found a passion for learning and the desire to follow my dreams. I don't know about you, but I'm fascinated by the language of flourishing and joy in this quotation. I'd be well happy if one of my students wrote that. I'm interested by the coming together of the intellectual, emotional, and social as domains of learning. They're getting this some way, somehow, through this platform. I'm quite encouraged by the image of community and the rekindling of passion and desire. I'm troubled, though, by the absence of the spiritual domain in this list. I'm troubled that the ultimate purpose is highly individualistic, because this is a posture orientated towards the American dream, which has proved to be remarkably elusive for all but the privileged few. Dreams, of course, can always be redreamt. You just have to put people back to sleep. The reforms that Comenius was advocating were innovative in his day, and there are echoes of much of them in Alt School. This means that we have to ask ourselves if the reason Alt School resonates so much with parents and students is because we have not actually built systems capable of fully reflecting these deep commitments to universal education, equality of access, holistic wisdom, and the centrality of the learner, which clearly penetrate our rhetoric, but not so much of our practice. Comenius's innovations in teaching and learning shaped much of what we would now recognize as excellent practice in pedagogy, and very few educators have ever heard of him. So David's new book about Comenius, I'm just giving him a plug here, is published by Classical Academic Press, and it does a lot to redress this, and I heartily recommend it to you. I think it remains the case, however, that our contemporary culture retains a significant blind spot when it comes to recognizing the centrality of a whole other dimension to Comenius's educational innovation. What's missing from our contemporary story of innovation and the reform of educational systems is not merely a moral anchor, but a deep commitment to the theological, the epistemological, and the tethered spirituality of Christian tradition. Descartes admonished Comenius for including too much theology and philosophy in these educational ideas. If Descartes thought that, goodness knows what critics would make today of Comenius's thesis that a distinctively Christian hope is essential to realizing these goals. Can a Christian school use the alt school learning platform? Will problem-based learning or classical liberal arts education foster innovation for learners? Is it okay for Christian colleges and universities to be entirely online? These are the wrong questions, although I think there might actually be quite a lot of mileage in considering the last one. These are the wrong questions because, as Kouros reminds us, they're mistaking innovation for technology and product. Also remember his argument about the misconception that innovation is just for the few, perhaps only for the young or the technically minded. Although technology and cheaper product imply greater quality of access for everybody, they're often the offerings cultivated by the few who've already successfully navigated the education market. Innovation is not necessarily democratic or universalizing. And I believe that the question we ought to be interested in is what's distinctive about a Christian posture of innovation in teaching and learning. I've been deliberately unpacking this question using a contemporary and a historic example because I want us to be able to dislocate innovation from the story that is told around it. It's a story that emphasizes change and progress as cultural goods. It's a story that is flippant about the past, obsessive about riches, self-expression, self-service, self-determination. This story is entirely a product of the reductionism that has penetrated our systems of education and our practices of teaching and learning. The same generation who are hurting and trying to question it and moving to California, at least metaphorically, are at the same time trapped inside of it and reproducing the story. My latest Netflix obsession is a fine illustration of the almost total penetration of this story into our Western culture. Girl Boss is, or was, because Netflix has since axed it, which shows you that I am no way a trendsetter or hip on any of these items. It's a US comedy loosely based on the sort of rags to riches tale of a San Francisco hipster, Sophia Amoruso, who made her fortune upcycling vintage clothes on eBay. And Sophia's goal is to have no boss but herself. In one episode, Sophia meets with another online retailer who also buys vintage clothes. But this lady does it in order to conserve them and preserve them as artifacts. She carefully wraps them in acid-free paper and invents stories about the people to whom they once belonged. She's a rather overweight, introverted, middle-aged fuddy-duddy who rarely leaves the house. Sophia, on the other hand, is the slim, young, and attractive, badass, rebellious innovator taking on the fashion industry. So much for the female gaze here, folks. In the episode, there's a poignant exchange about Sophia's dislocation from her family and her attempts to constantly reinvent herself. But in the end, she buys a 1920s prom dress, cuts it up, puts it back together, sells it for a huge profit. That's the story that our students are watching and hearing about the whole purpose of innovation. And it's a telos that Orthodox Christianity cannot affirm. A distinctively Christian posture of innovation will be orientated towards the other, driven by a concern for their good. Innovation that helps us to flourish ought not to emerge as a byproduct of the drive to upskill a new generation with technological and scientific fluency. One of the uncomfortable truths about the rapid acceleration, particularly of technological innovation in the West in the 20th and 21st centuries, is that many historians can account for it as a byproduct of international conflict and the requirements for modern warfare. The Christian telos affords innovation far more expansive horizons than this. Horizons orientated towards construction rather than destruction, motivated by love and worship rather than incentivized by fear and conflict. Grappling with what human flourishing consists of should be fundamental to the posture of innovation. It should inform the very questions posed and probed in our classrooms about who we are, what we could do differently, and why. When we determine that fostering innovation is going to be a learning goal for our classroom, a laboratory, or we design the posture of innovation as an outcome for a system of education, what we're doing then is we're creating education policy. And that policy ought to address at the outset the kinds of questions and problems the process of innovation will address and why. And that needs to happen, that discussion needs to happen before any curriculum content's included and any practices specifically adopted and any technology purchased. Then we can pay attention to the strategies of teaching and learning that will affirm such a posture. A distinctively Christian posture can affirm practices of creativity, experimentation, risk-taking, and the unintended consequences that often flow from innovation. It can affirm those as vocational. What I mean by this is that those are all ways of fulfilling our God-given purpose to make culture which rests in the hope of new creation. And the biblical telos of our restored personhood should better equip educators and learners to cope with the failures associated with the process of innovation. Mistakes and loss are not the end of the story, but brokenness is an inevitable experience along the way. Overcoming failure is a common motif in the popular story around innovation, and it's most often conquered kind of heroically. The person picks themselves up, the phoenix rises from the ashes, it moves forward. But what if you can't fix it? What if you can't move forward? The Christian telos gives a way to account for the lived reality that corruption and damage are both systemic in relationships and internal to our personhood. Those who innovate do not just need permission to fail, they need teaching and learning strategies that promote explicit reflection around failure and brokenness. And such reflection is necessary in order to recognize that distinctively Christian hope rests in new creation, not in utopia. Then we're finally able to turn our attention to the sorts of habits that will foster a posture of innovation in teaching and learning. No, I wanted that one up there. A distinctively Christian posture of innovation would be inclusive. Now, I don't mean here being mindful of digital literacy and ensuring that lack of social capital or financial resources are not acting as a barrier to anyone, important though those things are. I actually mean something even more risky than this. I mean that a distinctively Christian posture towards innovation has to embrace non-conformity. The habits we build around innovation need to allow for the rediscovery of old ways of doing things mixed in with the new. And that's going to result in messy patterns and tests and critical questions. And a consequence of this is that we would have to allow our neat educational pathways leading to higher education or a career in STEM, we would have to allow those to be traversed by dead ends, rabbit trails, and crop circles. These routes may be unfamiliar, and even worse, they may resist existing practices of evaluation and standardized testing. In principle, a Christian telos that roots our identity and our worth in our personhood and not in our assets, well, that ought to be a conducive environment for all of this. But I think that in practice, we might be required to let go of much of our institutional routines, dare I say it, shibboleths, in order to leave room for innovation. That will require the redemption of some other educational buzzwords, such as excellence, and I'll have more to say about that and hopefully in future publications. Suffice it to say that we will need to be prepared to revisit our language around success and the ways in which we measure it. Earlier this summer, I was picking plums with my friend Emma from the tree in our garden. We had a bumper crop this year, and the raccoons had been feasting in the tree overnight. So basically, if we didn't get our act together, we were going to lose out. Emma stood on quite a wobbly chair in order to reach the highest branches. She's tall, but it was still quite a stretch for her, and I just held the bowl. Little 4-year-old Megan, who lives next door, came out with a quizzical expression on her face, holding a long broom handle with a plastic bottle taped to the end. And the bottle had a square hole cut out of it, kind of plum-sized square hole. And she said, "Why don't you guys use this?" Because the square hole means that you can hook the bottle over the plums on the highest branches and harvest them without risking your life on a wobbly chair. And Megan's expression seemed to say, "Are you dumb? There's a safer way to do this." Matthew Crawford would call Megan's broom handle a jig. Megan's also invented quite a lot of less obviously useful creations that litter our backyard. Complicated, I come out in the morning and there's these patterns of stones, bottle tops, little pans of water from the play stove, and I know better now than to interfere with them. But Megan lives life within the radius of a few blocks, so school, church, home, family, backyard, and plum tree. And she plays. And her innovation, it doesn't have to be useful, monetarized, or large scale. But if it can help a friend out, so much the better. Megan instinctively adopts this posture of innovation. She hasn't been on a course to find out what it is and how to foster it. It will be very sad if when she goes to big school, she leaves this posture behind. Crawford would argue that our tendency to think on the corporate scale and to build monolithic institutional structures for the transmission of knowledge and ideas squeezes out innovation, or at least forces it to rest on very shaky foundations which are far removed from the local priorities and needs that should shape it. A distinctively Christian posture of innovation is like the little child who saw a need and from her store of time and play and experiments offered a solution that helped everyone to bring in the harvest. The kingdom of God is for such as these. Thank you. I am willing to take questions. I just need a moment to take a drink. And then thank you. Questions of clarification? Anything you liked, didn't like? Somebody like to jump in? Oh, I got 2 thumbs from Bram, so that's reassuring. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you, Beth. You are a rock star. David's right. Can you say a little bit about why you think Christian educators are reticent even toward the kind of innovation that you're describing here?
I think I was careful not to levy that charge. I think what I said is that people may find it tyrannous because it's not, because the story that's told behind it can be oppressive and functionalist. So I suppose I'm pushing back, are they reticent? Is that a fair criticism? I think this is something that, speaking personally and anecdotally from some of the teachers that I've worked with, possibly changes throughout our careers. So I think in the early stages, many of us have a vocation of teaching. We want to help people. We want to change the world. We have many, many, many ideas that are innovative and kind of new, tried and untested. And John Eckhart, who's a friend and colleague of mine at Wheaton, talks about how it's really hard to preserve that posture, that mindset, the further you get in to your career, and actually to recover that naivety in the good sense, that posture, is something that we as professionals need. And I have seen some wonderful examples of Christian educators who are innovative, but I actually think it's very counter to the systems that we are working within, and I think it gets pushed out of us. Yeah. There was a hand here, Ken.
I'd like you to address your own observations from your empirical research of a suspicion or something I've wondered about, which is those who would say or claim that they have a higher view of revelation, which for some I think means a kind of, in their view, a rock-solid epistemology, versus a pedagogy that seems to imply a constructivist or a softer epistemology. Is that just a distinction I made up, or how do you respond? Have you seen that, or how do you reconcile a high view of revelation, say, and a kind of a more open pedagogy?
So in answer to the first part of your question, yes, we do see it in the data. We see it in 2 ways. It's one of the things that I guess was my entry point into research in the first place. So for those of you who don't know, my doctoral work wasn't the big data space that I now occupy, overseeing the education survey at Cardus. It was an ethnographic study of a city technology college in England that was sponsored by a non-denominational Christian foundation, but it was run by Christians. And what's interesting is that city technology colleges were supposed to be they were quite an innovative education policy in the UK. But the pedagogy, and I would go back a step and say that the assumptions about teaching and learning in that school were all, I would categorize them as transmission mode of pedagogy. So there is one truth and you tell it, and knowledge is just about learning facts and reproducing facts. So in that context, there was a fear of what some people have described as constructivist pedagogies, because of the concern that to put the child at the center is to misalign the nature of authority, and that it's very important to remain faithful to biblical tradition by ticking a list of, these are the things that I believe and I know why I believe them. What was interesting about that particular school, though, is that it wasn't aligned with one church. So it wasn't that the families of a particular church were choosing to send their children there. It was a publicly funded school in the UK. It couldn't select its intake. So the children, the youth and community that were coming to the school were from all kinds of churched, unchurched backgrounds. So their encounter with Christianity was through this lens. And they bought into this sense that here's a truth, I weigh up the truth claims, I decide whether they're true or false, and then I've done what's required of me in this school. And the vast majority of the students did that. They weighed up the claims. They decided Christianity wasn't for them. That was the end of their encounter. And so what I would try and almost flip your question round and say, think of the results of what you're doing there. Because you've presented somebody with a list of rules. This is what we believe about God. Unless you accept these, unless you believe they're true, that's the end of the journey for you. There's no encounter there with a God who's strange, with a God who shows up, which I also think is part of the fullness of the biblical story. But these bits are absent from the way that they're encountering the whole. I would say that there are huge gaps in the whole way that they're presented the narrative of God and how God meets with us, and that. What they're dismissing as constructivist, remember I started off with a description of the philosophical tradition within which I stand, which doesn't deny absolute truth, but says that it's always mediated, that we meet God because of the way he's made us, because of the differences in us, because of the mess in the context in which we live. That's how we meet God. We can still find him. But so to confuse the interpretive lens, to confuse the mess with like the other end of the spectrum of total relativism where there's no story, that was the mistake they were making. That was the epistemological mistake. And as a result, God's bigger than that, and hopefully those young people will encounter him in the strange and messy ways he will show up in the rest of their lives. But it was heartbreaking because it was the completely opposite effect of what they had intended, which was to give the people evidence so they could know it was true and they could be safe and believe, and they'd all be fine. Now that was just one study. What we're seeing in the Cardis, the big mapping work that we're doing with the Cardis Education Survey is different because we're not investigating individual schools in that study. We're looking at sector effects, and we don't know all that much yet about the kinds of practices around teaching of the Bible curriculum, or how faith, how epistemology, how teaching practices are playing out in different parts of the curriculum, so we don't know that. But what we are seeing when we look at the profiles, particularly of graduates who have attended evangelical Protestant schools, private independent Protestant schools in both Canada and the US, there's a high propensity towards some of the practices, religious practices that can on their own be associated with those transmission modes of pedagogy, the kind of pietistic practice. If I check this list of things, then I know I'm safe. So I would love to probe that a bit more to see if that is what's going on, because I would want to challenge that through the practice lens and say there might be some other ways of opening up how you think about what it means to know and how people learn. Sorry, that was a really long answer, but... Hi, yeah.
I'm wondering about distinctively Christian posture for K-12 public schools in the U.S. What does that look like? Where you make space for this kind of messiness, this kind of inquiry.
Yeah.
With that extra layer that is distinctively Christian.
Yeah. So of course, the difference you have in the US compared to Canada and the UK, which is where the bulk of my experience and work has been, is the separation of church and state, and your inability to put confessional language around this. But what's interesting is that I still think that many of these practices express who God is, even if we're not able to use explicitly the confessional language around the practices. That's the beauty, I think, of just the way that the attractiveness of these postures and practices, because they're orientated to how we were made. So it's not surprising that they work and that they're attractive, that they can draw people into a story. You do have to think about what you can do legitimately within your vocation in that space, because one of the things we know about learning is the encounter on its own is not enough. At some point, people have to be, you have to have an explanation for what's going on. That has to be kind of, you have to lead people into that, and that's more difficult. I've got less, if anybody else has got experience of working in the public school system in the US where they've been able to do that, I'd be really interested to hear about it. One of the ways in which I'm bumping up against this is around initiatives where Christians are quite excited about the opportunity to open charter schools or frame charter schools. And the thing that I'm interested in as I watch them wrestle with some of these questions is it going to be enough to bolt on explicit teaching about Christianity in like after school, before and after school programs, which are run separately, in which that legal divide, you can sort of cross it. And I'm also worried about naively in kind of importing into those models kind of the untethered Aristotelian character programs, for example, about like, I would say I would think that would be problematic, but yeah. In terms of the postures that you can act, I would imagine that there's a lot that you can do. Yeah, we thought about that intentionally when we were thinking about the design of the What If Learning website in the UK, because we were aware that lots of Christian teachers might be using it in a classroom context that was in a state secular school. And our question was, well, will this work? Will they be able to move through this cycle of the reframing, the picking of the strategies, and the reflecting on, like, particular reflection of habits? Actually, we found that Christian teachers in Christian schools, where you would think this was nailed, have experienced a lot of dissonance and don't always function well with the posture. So there's still a lot of work to do. Yeah. Everyone is sleepy. Succeeded in tiring you all out. Hi.
Hi. Yes, is there a role for worship in helping us develop this distinctive Christian posture of innovation?
Yeah, and I haven't thought much about that, so I'm really grateful for you for raising it. I've got it written kind of around the edges of a number of my sort of pieces that I'm working through and thinking about, because I'm sure the answer is yes, and I didn't start thinking about it in relation to innovation, actually. I started thinking about it in the context of my own strategic planning at Cardiff, because I'm not a teacher anymore and I don't have a class. And I was thinking about, well, where's worship in this platform for research that I'm building? If I think that this is really important for centering us rightly in relationship with God and with others, how do I build worship into a research platform or a research program? Is it that we say prayers together as a team when we meet? Well, yes, it might be that, but I think it might be more than that. So I haven't even managed to answer it in the scope of the platform that I'm doing. But certainly for, I'm just thinking about some work that a doctoral student of mine did on worship. And one of the things that she looked at was, and this was in the context of church schools, and it wasn't around innovation, it was around kind of collective worship at the beginning of the day. But some of the things that came out of Alison's work were about naming things as particular times for focus, naming things and spaces as ways of drawing particular attention to who God is and how we delight in his creation and what we see, and setting things aside as kind of almost like holy ground. And I'm thinking, well, as you set up a sequence, set up space for innovation in a school, or maybe a sequence, it's often orientated in a curriculum space. I'm sure you could bring that framing in. I'm sure you could do it. But yeah, that is something I've got to think about further. Yeah, all suggestions on a postcard. because it would seem to me to be really important in this putting God back into the center of telos and purpose and shape and framing.
Thinking about the language of posture, which I find to be really helpful, and about the ways in which, within the metaphor, our bodies are recruited for different kinds of postures.
Yeah.
Right? You're recruited by other kinds of practices. And it strikes me, especially around the question of creating space for failure. Accreditation reporting is not a really friendly space to have a posture that creates space for failure. And in many of our professional capacities, there's very much a sense of the necessity of the performance of mastery at every turn. So I wonder if you've thought about or could talk about practices of resistance and the kinds of pedagogical practices that do form us in the kind of posture that you're talking about. It strikes me that it's running opposite to some of the things already in place.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think that's partly why the angst around innovation as tyrannous is because to really open up the space is actually to, it's a anti-revolution maybe. But those practices of resistance, and there are ways to, this is going to sound backwards, but there are ways to legitimate resistance and to allow to allow kind of encounters to run against the grain of the institutional space that you're in, and to do that safely. And I think I actually need to read more about pedagogies of resistance to answer your question fully. It's another box I could usefully consider, particularly how we take, a different stance against what the system requires of us.
Well, I think it doesn't have to be the system. It can also be the ways, not within my current institution, but
Yeah.
the ways I've been formed as an academic and a teacher,
Yeah.
quite apart from the system I'm in now.
Right. Yeah. Sorry, I tend to think at systems level now because I'm not in the classroom space anymore. But that's also true. Yeah.
One of the things that sometimes strikes me as a bit kind of bizarre about our cultural place in history is that it sometimes seems like at one and the same time we can dig in hard on certain things that we don't want to change, right? And they can be things that I think in the long haul of history are going to seem incredibly trivial. And at the same time swallow whole massive innovations that are totally restructuring our lives and the way we live together and so on. Somebody comes along and says, I'm going to invent a device that will totally restructure all of your relationships.
Yeah. And we're all on it, live tweeting.
And look, it's the same people, right? That we can one at the same time have this sort of deeply conservative, it's not going to change. Here we stand, draw the line, and then something radically restructuring comes along. We don't even think it's an issue. It's just like, I need one of those for my birthday. So it seems to be from that, we seem to be incredibly bad at weighing the weight of an innovation, right? And sort of knowing what might be a significant one and what might not be a significant one. Do you have any thoughts on that in relation to education and pedagogy and so on? Like, is that something we could do better at teaching? Like, what's a big deal and what's not a big deal?
I think it's notoriously difficult to actually analyse the cultural moment that you're in, that you're part of. I've just come from a week of leadership meetings at Cardiff where I've been trying to do that, because with hindsight, things that Christians paid attention to and made a big fuss about are actually not where we, in the 1990s, are not where we are now. But there's something around your word weight that I think is really important to the sort of skills of how to make reasoned judgments and evaluations, and by time and allow ourselves time to see what happens before we all jump on bandwagons, and to think about the kind of evidence that we would use to decide whether something's positive or harmful. And part of the problem is we've lost I feel like we've lost the space and time to do that. And I think that's sort of what Alan Jacobs is talking about in terms of the slower pace of time. And also in that article, he's talking about people with fewer resources having to try stuff out and having to put things together made out of odd bits, rather than, we're given an iPhone and the whole point about it is you can't take it apart and you can't repair it, and it's not actually built to last. And our buying into all of those traditions removes I think it impairs our facility to weigh things up and make reasoned judgments. Yeah. But I think we're going to do very badly at kind of naming now what will change in the future. I kind of think that's a waste of resources. Yeah. Yeah.
That the question related to, how we assess what's an important period of innovation and time.
Yeah.
But also, in any system, there are cycles of change
Yes.
and then need
Yeah.
to settle into new
Yes.
patterns
Yes.
and rest in
Yes.
new patterns,
Yeah.
consolidating
Yeah.
the pattern of doing something
Yeah.
before you're ready to push
Yeah.
ahead
Yeah.
again.
Yeah.
And I wondered if there's any theology about the nature of human persons, and maybe about the place of worship and Sabbath as
Yeah.
a
I
place
was.
where we
Yeah.
rest and say, maybe we're not, we don't
Yeah.
have to be a child right
Yeah. Yeah.
now. We don't have to.
Yeah. I think that's really, really important too, because one of the things that technology has challenged are fundamental rhythms within creation, right, of which rest and worship are important parts of what we need as humans beings and what we need as community. And so for us as a Christian community, as a school or a classroom or a college, to actually insist on those rhythms playing out. That's actually, it's one of the luxuries, isn't it, that you miss when you move on, if you have been a traditional full-time student, and that's a big if now, when you move into the world of work and suddenly you don't have like the downtimes of, midterm breaks or Christmas, the lengthy Christmas holidays or academic summers. Gosh, I miss those. Like I have 15 days off a year now, and I didn't realize how settled I'd been in those routines and how they actually, in my case, what I miss is that space to think, because that's when I used to get my thinking done, and I don't have that anymore. So I think that draws to creating the space for worship in Sabbath and in those rhythms in relation to how we think about this could be very important. Yeah. So you didn't really need me, that you've put the themes together yourselves. Yeah.
So just maybe what you think of this. So maybe in response to David's comment, you think of the Amish, right, to try to determine the weight of something by having one of their communities try it out.
Yes. Yeah.
And sort of
Yeah.
see what the
Yeah.
effect it would be on
Yeah.
the whole. But
Yeah.
as a whole society, we can't do that, right? Because there's no shared vision of what the good would be once you tried it out.
Right.
It's almost like you're still on this.
That's it. It's part of the habit now.
And it's
Yeah.
just going.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can't rein it in
Yeah.
with any understanding of what the good is. So I don't know, thoughts on.
Yeah, because that's where that's where the community of practice piece, if you think about the three legs of my stool, that's what community of practice is giving you, the physical space to do that within, and the bounds within shared tradition, which is also part of how you weigh up whether something is harmful, helpful, useful, not useful, and rooted again in the group of people with whom you regularly worship, rest. Yeah, yeah. I should say that I chose the example of Megan. So I live on a street in an intentional community with other Christians. We don't share all our same houses, but we're kind of in a row, and it's reintroduced me to those ideas of what it means to intentionally do life with a small group of people and reintroduce patterns of rhythm and rest and worship and prayer together, and shared meals, which we do every Friday. And actually, that's been a really wonderful experience for me, especially rocking up in a new country where I didn't have anybody that I knew, but even for deeper, more profound reasons than that. So Megan's not incidental to all of this. She's been part of why I've been thinking about it, because she's in my community, she's in my family. Yeah.
Just focusing on the words and what Megan had, right? She had a store of time and play and experiments.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you chose those deliberately. So how do we have those, and how do we encourage those? Time
Yeah. So I don't know if you've read The Slow Professor. That's a really interesting book by two Canadian researchers about basically giving ourselves permission within the academic profession. So kind of, not written from a Christian perspective as far as I'm aware, but to like this sense of these are the things that are missing in the practice and performance of academia, and what would it look like if we didn't have to get our 4 publications out over 4 years and be folded into a particular cycle, and we actually took time back. But as a school, you'd have to be prepared to do things like collapse the curriculum and block things differently and do different, work in teams around things. There are actually a lot of schools, Christian and public, in Hamilton that do that. So there are some ways of thinking about and organize, because you have to organize time differently, and think about the disciplinary boundaries between subject curriculums differently. In the secondary setting, I have a feeling elementary schools do that better than us most of the time, because of the way that classrooms are orientated, but yeah.